rain. So yeah, as I said, over the course of this event, we've seen some really intense rainfall rates, and it's fallen on some very wet catchments, and we've seen some increased flooding and some pretty catastrophic impacts across eastern New South Wales. With this approach of the new system coming through, from the west, which is approaching today, we're expecting this heavy rain to fall in areas that haven't seen as much rain over the last few days, and we're expecting the flood risk to develop in those areas as well. So severe weather warning was reissued again this morning. It's been extended to include the South Coast districts for tomorrow, but also the western districts of New South Wales for today and tomorrow as well. So those areas west of the divide on the western slope, so we're talking Moree, Dubbo, Armidale, Tamworth, right down towards the central west slope, can expect to see increasing rainfall over the next 24 to 36 hours, and then tomorrow that focus will shift over towards the south coast. So the flood risk, so that we're expecting clearance from this system to occur either late tomorrow, or on Wednesday, depending on which part of the state you're in. But the flood risk will continue for several days. We are urging the community who are well aware of the flood risk, they've been watching the news and feeling the rain come down and seeing the swollen rivers, to continue to take care, continue to monitor conditions where you are, watch out for what warnings being issued from the Bureau, and most importantly, to heed the advice of our emergency services, who are working hard to keep you safe. I can answer some more questions afterwards, but at the moment I'll just hand over to Justin to talk you through the flood risk.
Okay, thank you, Jane. I guess my thoughts really go out to those impacted communities and individuals. This has been a very significant flood event for New South Wales. I've been a flood forecaster in the Bureau for 20 years, and this is probably the worst flooding that I've experienced and I've had to forecast. And there's been a lot of focus on the Hawkesbury and Nepean Valley, where in some locations we've had the worst flooding since 1961, where the river levels at Penrith actually peaked yesterday afternoon at a level higher than 61. We've now seen the peaks reach down into Penrith, and we're expecting the floodwaters to peak at Windsor later this afternoon at flood levels something near the 1988 event. But it's not just Hawkesbury and Nepean. This is a statewide flood event. We've got a flood watch that covers all the way from the Queensland border down to the Victorian border, all of those coastal rivers. So expecting this rainfall in the coming days to cause flooding in those rivers, renewed flooding in many of those communities that have already been impacted by flooding over the last couple of days. Just last night at Kempsey, we had the river levels there rise to pretty much the same level that impacted just 1 or 2 days ago. And they are not just the only community impacted. We've also extended the flood watch to cover areas of inland New South Wales, and we're particularly concerned about the northwestern catchments of New South Wales, where we might see some potentially moderate or even major flooding at some locations. So we're really looking at the areas of the Upper McIntyre, Inverell, Ashford. These are the locations where you might potentially see some major flooding. Also in the Namoy, the Peel River, where we might see some of that moderate major flooding develop. Obviously, still early days with the rainfall forecasts, and the Bureau will be updating both its flood watches and its flood warnings regularly throughout the day. So I think there's one sort of message I want to give to impacted residents is really keep across the Bureau's updated flood warnings. They provide detailed forecasts for all of the impacted communities, and also keep across the information being provided from your local SES and state SES about what appropriate actions to take. So I think it's quite a dangerous situation that New South Wales is currently facing, and we all have to work together to stay safe. Thank you.
Justin, you've talked about the Sydney region, the North Coast, the North West New South Wales. What about the South Coast of New South Wales? Do you expect to see some flooding down there as well?
So we're expecting to see some flooding. We've got the flood watch covering now. We've got a flood warning out for the Dewar River, which is upstream of Maruya. We've also got a flood watch covering the Bega River Valley. But our hope is that will be more around the minor to moderate level of flooding, rather than some of the major flooding that we've seen along the mid-north coast and also across the Sydney Basin.
In terms of Sydney, you said the flood peak has passed at Penrith, but it's still still going to get higher at Windsor.
Yep.
What's the general prognosis for the Sydney area? Once it peaks at Windsor, is that it? Is the danger point passed for Sydney?
So that flood water continues downstream to locations such as Sackville and Wiseman's Ferry. But I think the other thing we need to be aware of, we're still forecasting more rainfall over the coming days. So we anticipate this will cause the flooding to continue longer than we would previously be expected. But it's also possible that we might get some renewed and high level river level rise in some of those locations. But as always with forecast rain, you have to be very careful and make sure that you're abreast of the latest updates. And the Bureau has got a team, not just our New South Wales forecasters, but we've brought our flood forecasters from around the country to support this flood operations, to make sure that those warnings are updated regularly for the communities impacted.
Can you talk through the chronology for people who are sitting somewhere in Western Sydney or out the back of the plains? Can you talk through the chronology of where this water is going and when, so people just get a sense of what to expect over the next 24 hours, I guess, as best known?
So it's currently peaked at Penrith, and that happened at 10 a.m. I should say that happened, it was 10 metres at around 6 p.m. yesterday. We then saw that peak then moving to North Richmond, where that peaked about 7 p.m. And we now have that flood peak then reaching Windsor. We're expecting that to peak around 13 metres this evening. And then the floodwaters then continue downstream to, I'll just bring out the warning for a bit more detail for you, to Sackville. We're expecting that to peak near the major flood level overnight tonight, and then we'll then head down towards Lower Portland. We're actually expecting a major flood peak around 4 p.m. on Monday, and that level is expected to be similar to the 1990 flood event. And then it heads down further into the Wiseman's Ferry. But it's not just about this flood peak that's currently moving through the system. We've still got more rainfall forecast for the next couple of days, so we might well see some renewed river level rises in, say, the upper parts of the catchment, for example, in the upper Nepean River Valley.
You mentioned this sort of a border-to-border sort of emergency situation at the moment. Just how rare is it to see that sort of area under warnings or watches?
I think the last really widespread flood event we can remember like this down the coast was the 2016 flood, where we saw virtually every single catchment along that coast impacted. But what's been unusual about this event, it's really impacting the Sydney area, but also we've got the second event which is developing in inland New South Wales, and that's very unusual, and it's going to be a lot of work for both the impacted residents but also the emergency services and the Bureau.
So what's the risk to Western New South Wales, and what are the key areas of concern in that area?
So I think the areas of concern are really those communities along the Hawkesbury Nepean River. So that's the locations that I've been talking about: Penrith, Windsor, North Richmond, Wiseman's Ferry, as you move down through the river system. But it's also going to impact parts of Sydney more generally with the heavy rainfall that's forecast for the coming days. Jane, do you want to talk about some of the heavy rainfall across the Sydney region?
Yeah, we could expect across the Sydney region another 50 to 100 millimetres in places over the next 24 to 36 hours. More broadly across the state, some areas will see more than that. So the south coast tomorrow, we're expecting anywhere in the range of 200 to 300 millimetres as that system progresses that way. Up on the mid-north coast, I could pick up another 100 mils or more today, and out in western, the northwestern slopes and plains. A particular concern for today and early tomorrow could pick up a couple of 100 millimetres. So what we're seeing at the moment is we're seeing some storm. It's already started over inland New South Wales, but I guess in that northwestern slopes area, it's not too heavy at the moment. But we've been watching some storms out near Tibooburra, Barona Downs that are dropping some really intense rates, and that's heading towards those areas. So, yeah, as Justin was saying, it's really a statewide event and of concern that we're facing, and we're really urging residents across the state to stay on top of the warnings being issued and the advice of emergency services.
So what's actually causing all of this heavy rainfall at the moment, especially as it progresses to northwestern New South Wales?
Yeah, so it's a combination of this continued tropical feed of moisture, which is associated with the trough that's generated the rain we've seen over the last 4 days. So that feed coming in from the tropics means it's easier to get heavy rainfall. There's more moisture in the atmosphere, but we've got quite an intense system coming through from the south, which is what you see is when you have different air masses collide. That's where you see intensification of the weather, and that's what we're seeing at the moment. So this tropical feed colliding with this feed coming in from the south to southwest.
Jane, what can we expect for the New England northwest over the next several days, and are there any particular areas of concern there?
Yeah, so the northwest, it's started raining at the moment. It's not particularly heavy. What we'd expect over the next 24 to 36 hours, or by tonight, is that those rainfall rates up that way have increased, and for that rain to continue through tonight and into tomorrow morning at least, before clearing out later tomorrow. The flood risk will follow the rain, but certainly from later today through to tomorrow, that area should be quite vigilant.
Okay, and in terms of Western New South Wales generally, what's the rainfall situation there? Can you give us a bit more detail?
Yeah, sure. So Western New South Wales, we refer to Western New South Wales as west of the Great Dividing Range. So we're seeing a very large cloud mass pretty much covering that entire area at the moment. And out of that cloud mass, we're seeing from light showers through to really intense storms. So that's what's happening at the moment. It's quite variable depending where in Western New South Wales you are, and that's a really large area. But the commonality across all areas is an increase in rainfall over the next 24 to 36 hours, and as you approach the slopes of the ranges, the flood risk occurring.
And I've heard that in some of these parts of Western New South Wales, which have lower rainfall, generally the totals they could get could effectively be like a season's worth of rain in just a couple of days. Is that
Yeah,
is that the case?
that's entirely possible. And we've seen that on the east coast as well in the last 4 days.
And what effects could that have to, places like Burke and stuff which aren't used to getting this level of rainfall coming down?
Yeah, so probably the heavier rain, so the Burke area will get some good rain from these storms going through. I think maybe the main signature will be a bit further east of that, but that is quite a significant agricultural region of New South Wales, so we can expect some impacts on agriculture out that way, and certainly if they're getting that much rain, there'll be impacts on transport routes as well.
Jane, just in terms of the intensity of this rain, obviously we're seeing some of the areas that were hit earlier get hit again, but we're also seeing some new areas, as you were talking about, coming into play. Just for people who, I guess, haven't been in the rain for the last couple of days, just how intense could this be? Is this the sort of stuff that can bring down flash flooding and those sort of conditions into some of these communities?
Yeah, certainly. So the numbers we're getting just from these storms out in the Tibooburra kind of area, which is far western New South Wales, we're seeing around about 30 to 35 millimetres in an hour. That's typically what they'd see maybe in a month. I'll have to check that figure, but that's a lot of rain to get in that amount of time as we approach the western slopes and this system really ramps up a bit more. They'll be seeing a couple of hundred millimetres probably, so very significant, and that amount of water over that ground can cause some, particularly with the catchment so wet at the moment already, you'd expect some flash flooding to be there. I don't know, Justin, if you wanted to add something to that?
I just think just to re-emphasise what Jane said, we've got widespread rainfall forecast for the next couple of days, especially across northwest of New South Wales, along the coast of New South Wales. Many of these catchments are pretty much totally saturated or have just had recent flooding. So what this means is there's really increased the flood risk. So most of that rain that does fall, we actually end up as runoff into the rivers and then cause that widespread flooding, which impacts local communities, businesses, transport routes, agriculture. I think like a lot of people said, this is like a statewide flood event which is impacting multiple people, multiple agencies across New South Wales. And I just really like to remind people that it's a changing situation and it's an evolving flood and weather event, and to keep across those updates that the Bureau has on its website. So the teams are regularly updating all of those detailed predictions, both the weather forecasts, the Bureau's flood forecasts, our flood watches, and we'll be providing as much information as we can to the impacted communities, and also listen to the instructions from the SES that can really help you stay safe in this time.
And I'm assuming this new weather, this new rain band that's coming in from the west is kind of just what already flooded communities didn't need to happen. Is this just going to exacerbate the current issues they've got?
Yeah, so I think that's what we're very concerned about, especially along those mid-north coast catchments, with some locations like Taree had virtually record flooding. So, I mean, those communities do not want to have another flood event this week. But our hope is that over the next few days, we'll start seeing that weather easing, and then we'll also see some of that flood potential easing as well. But in Western New South Wales, obviously the water doesn't head out to the ocean, so we'll expect to see the flooding in those locations last for a much longer period of time.
Jane, I guess the one question everyone wants to answer, when do we finally see the end of this?
Yeah, so this rain, next 24 to 36 hours. So for Sydney, we might see some stars tomorrow night, which will be nice. And it will take a little bit longer to clear in the south. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Got a few things here.
Got enough notes then?
Yep.
Okay, thank you everybody.
Thank you very much. Thanks guys, all good? Thank you, happy? Thank you very much. Meetings, it's all get sorted out.
Awesome.